storage of military planes in the country. Some of these were used clear back in the Korean War era in the late 50s, some in Vietnam, some in the Gulf War. Over here to the right now you're seeing cargo planes. You'll see that the windows are taped up, the engines are taped up. Supposedly, these planes can be ready to fly within a couple of hours, is what they claim. You see in the background there, refueler planes. There'll be submarine hunters, all just quite a variety, and it just goes on for forever. There's F-4 Phantoms over here, fighter jets. Just quite a variety of planes. Over a little further up, when we get a little further up, you'll see off to the left. I don't know if we'll get any views of them today, but there's some great big strategic bombers that were on patrol 24 hours a day, 7 days a week during the Cold War era.
That was Papa.
Actually starting in the late 60s and continuing
Sorry,
on.
that's what Papa did. What? It was on
So those are some of the early F-16 fighter jets over here on the right.
Let me see Papa's plane here.
There's actually a Titan missile museum that's south of Tucson, and I went and visited it a year ago or so, and it was quite an eye-opener for me because I could run it through the filter of Malachi 4 and place it. We were under threat of being of a nuclear attack with the Russians back in the early 60s, and we were scrambling to get intercontinental ballistic missiles fielded so that the Russians would know that if they struck us, that we would strike them back. And so we scrambled, and we finally got the Titan missile. Those are warthogs, is what they're called over here. Those are tank killers. When the Iraqis saw them coming during the Gulf War, they just got out of their tanks and ran. So we scrambled to get these missiles fielded in time, and they were set up so that once you push the button, so to speak, there was no calling them back. And that's where the concept of detente or mutually assured destruction came into play. Before then, they could strike us before we had a chance to strike back. We just didn't have the time. But once these missiles were fielded, now the Russians had to pause and think again. So the first Titan missile went on alert here on March 17th of 1963. Does that have any significance to anybody? Anybody know what took place on that date? God in simplicity? The opening of the seals, that was the first message. When the hair stood up on the back of my neck when I saw when these silos, these missile sites went on alert, because I realized that the book hadn't opened, and the book was just opening, and we couldn't be destroyed yet by Russia. So God had to step in because he knew that you and I hadn't come forth yet. So he stepped in, allowing this technology to be in place to hold back destruction. We're going to turn right here. I'm sorry, brother. To hold back destruction until we all come in. You're going to see some examples of that here at the Air and Space Museum today. I'm hoping that somebody will give us a talk on the SR-71 Blackbird, which some of the technology that's in that plane is still top secret, and that was developed in the late 50s and early 60s. Also holding back, the angels holding back destruction. Okay, so we're going to stay to the left side, and it shouldn't be too much further up. So you're going to see today, as we go to the Air and Space Museum, you're going to get a glimpse of all the technology that was actually ahead of its time, that was developed in the early 50s and 60s, and I believe all for the purpose of holding things back. We know that destruction's coming, but there's a people that had to get ready first. It'll be slow, and when they've got a machine gun on it that when they first developed it, they fire at such a rapid rate that it actually could stall the plane. So they had to slow down the firing rate of the machine gun.
Is it 220 mils?
Yes, that is right. And it also carries some rockets.
Yeah. It's crazy. You can cut a tank in half with it.
You just slice it up. That's right. Over here to the right is a salvage yard where they chop. It's kind of like a automobile junkyard, but it's a plane junkyard, and they chop up planes and use the parts.
See that? It actually lands into the water.
So you like.
I hope we get to see
I would
inside.
love to go through there and see some
Seth,
Oh, no
we're probably
kidding.
gonna go
Sit up
inside
there,
and
the
play,
green.
right?
Radars and guidance systems for missiles and different things. We've actually worked on the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter that has recently remapped the moon. Some things for the Mars Explorer. And so I've been working on advanced technology my whole life, and of course the natural and the spiritual type one another, so it's given us some good insights. So we'll turn left here. I've worked on technology that we've shared with Israel that I believe Israel will use when all nations come against her. One of the last things that we worked on was the Iron Dome that's in place right now that protects Israel from the Katyusha rockets and different things that come against them. So it'll be, just continue on straight, and there'll be bus parking there in the back.
Plane fans too. How's everybody doing? So the plan, as I understand it this morning, is we're going to take a driving tour out back. We have about 80 acres of airplanes out back, and we'll look at those for about an hour. We'll see if a lot of people are snoring. We may cut it a little bit short. And then I'm going to drop you off, and you'll have some free time to walk around. And I'll show you I'll tell you about what's in the hangars that we're not obviously driving into that you can go see. There's also a gift shop and a grill. The grill is excellent, and the gift shop has something for everybody. We're just waiting now while Doug and Jennifer check in, and then we'll publicly funded museum here in the United States. So the Air Force Museum and the Smithsonian are bigger, but they're taxpayer funded. And this museum's growing all the time. It covers about 80 acres, and I'll show you most of the 80 acres while we're driving around. And we're getting new planes all the time. In fact, tomorrow, if you look over your left shoulder, you can see that's Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. You can see one of the hangars over there. And that's where those planes that we saw flying are taken off from. It's really beyond the brighter one. That's hangar 3, and then the brighter colored yellow one is hangar 4. Somebody mentioned oh no, it wasn't in the script, the painted airplanes. No, there was an art exhibit that was here a couple of years ago, and you can see those funky painted planes. But they realized that it was supposed to be a traveling art display, and they realized it was too expensive to take the planes apart and ship them anywhere, so they just got left here. The planes with orange trim are wildfire fighting airplanes. So you may have seen them around Washington and British Columbia. We certainly see them a lot here in Arizona. Okay, I'll be back in a second. Wow. Do you sing or dance? Some of the planes here are obviously going to be restored. Some of the planes, like if you look immediately off to your left, may never see the light of day. A couple of Coast Guard jets on the right. About a month ago was the U.S. Coast Guard Aviation 100th birthday. Did anybody celebrate? Yes, good. Congratulations. Happy birthday. Actually, I ask that question on every tour, and you're the first person to say yes. Good. In between the two Coast Guard jets is the C-119 called the Flying Boxcar. You can see it has these double booms in back and twin rudders. This was a favorite plane for paratroopers, military paratroopers. Anybody ever jump out of one? If I hear yes from the same guy who celebrated the birthday, I'm going to be suspicious. Military paratroopers favored them because there was no fuselage or tail or anything to bump into when you jump out of the plane. They were, clear of the plane as soon as they jumped out, so it was a good plane to jump out of.
The other one's
What A-10's taking out there?
I know. Every time
Yeah, a couple more A-10s taking off out of DM on the right. And you'll see we have an A-10 inside Hangar 1 near the SR-71, so you'll be able to see it when you go into Hangar 1. The big propeller plane on the right with that shark fin on top, that's an EC-121. The shark fin is a radar, and there's another radar underneath the plane without it, doesn't have its cover on it, so you can see that also. This was both an Air Force and a Navy plane that it was kind of an early AWACS plane. It could detect other planes and vector fighters towards it if necessary during the early part of the Cold War. I'll show you a couple other constellations that we have here. We have 3 of them altogether. You may recognize the TWA version better than this gray one here. The next plane on your right, the big green and tan one, is a B-52 bomber. This is a G model B-52. The U.S. Air Force is still flying about 75 of the H model planes, but the Gs have all been sent to museums or destroyed. Some of the cut up Gs are across the street at Davis Mountain in the boneyard there. G models flew up through roughly the early 90s, and then they were retired. All the B-52s were built in the 50s and early 60s. So the ones flying today, the H models flying today, some of them are actually being flown by the grandchildren of the original flight crews. Is my hair sticking up?
I don't know.
Okay, good. A couple other, everybody recognizes the United Airlines 727 on the left. It's missing the 2 outboard engines. You can see the engine intake for the center engine. And the Navy C-9, number 9120 there, is a passenger and cargo plane that the Navy used to fly. Looks just like a regular DC-9, except it has a cargo hatch on it. The black plane on the right is a D model B-52. This was a veteran of the Vietnam War. You can see that huge fuel tank outboard on the wing, outboard of the engines. And that thing underneath it is actually a wheel. And when the wings and those 3,000-gallon external tanks are full of fuel, that wheel is resting on the ground. So there's a lot of flex in the wings. You can see this B-52 is getting taped up. It still has some painting that needs to be done before it's put back out on display. And I'll show you one other B-52 when we get out into the main part of the yard. If you look over to the left, the big hangar is our restorations hangar, and this big concrete area is a wash pad so we can capture any contaminants that are washed off the planes. So you see those 2 Rolls-Royce Trent 1000 engines under the blue covers? Everybody see them over on the left? Yeah, those are the, let's just call them the display engines that are going to go on the 787 before it's put out on display. So they just came in yesterday on a big flatbed, and this blue thing here sitting out in the middle, I believe is what they use to take the engine on and off the plane. I don't know. But you can see several of those blue rigs around. I think that's how they're going to do it.
Like the
Okay, so if you've had your eyes closed, you can open them now. We're leaving. You'll see a big Lockheed C-141, big cargo troop transport. The hump on top of the fuselage over where it says U.S. Air Force, That's where the refueling receptacle is, so it can refuel in flight.
Your slime is a big mess.
So you can see the plane that says United States of America on it with the big flag on the tail. That is the Air Force One, but we're going to come back out this way. We'll get much closer to it and talk about it in a few minutes. I'm sorry?
That's Kennedy's plane.
Kennedy and Johnson used it. Yeah, but only to go into small airplanes. Off to the right, you can see the second of our constellations in TWA colors. Everybody remembers the Howard Hughes movie, right? No? Yes? No? Howard Hughes was a aviation enthusiast and a real rich guy, so into World War II he was involved with Lockheed in building this passenger liner. So coming up on the left side is the China Southern 737. This was also a gift from Boeing, donated to the museum by Boeing. And I hope one day maybe we'll see classrooms inside there. I did take a class of students in there once to take some pictures to send to Boeing.
Harrier? That's a Harrier, it goes straight up. That's how it takes off. They're British.
Okay, so coming up on the right, these two green camouflage planes in U.S. Marine colors are Harriers. What's the Harrier's special capability? Yeah, vertical lift, commonly known as the jump jet. It was a British airplane, and the British flew Harriers in the South Atlantic in 1982 in the Falklands War, and I'll show you the type of plane that the Argentines flew against the Harriers. But the U.S. Marines fly them also. If you look forward of the wing, you can see a duct, not like a quack duct, no, but like an air conditioning duct, pointing downward, and that's how the plane develops that vertical lift capability. On number 14, that's the single-seat attack plane, and that pole sticking out of the left engine, that's a refueling probe. Number 04, that's a two-seat trainer. The Harriers are being replaced. Anybody know what plane's replacing the Harriers? So the U.S. Marines are buying the new Lockheed F-35 Lightning II, or the Joint Strike Fighter. It's going to be a tri-service airplane. The U.S. Navy, the Air Force, and the Marines are getting it, along with a lot of allies. And on the B model that the Marines will fly, the exhaust nozzle rotates downward to give it vertical lift. Yeah. But I got to tell you a secret. They're being made in China. What's it say right here?
Made in China.
Made in China.
Hopefully it can stay long.
I'm sorry?
Hopefully it has nice
He's just like no more. That means it won't have
She's
good
made in
quality.
China. She's good quality.
Welcome. Good quality. Okay, I'm going to show you a couple more airplanes on the right side, but before we do, the building on the left, when you have free time after getting off the bus, this is the 390th Bomb Group Memorial Museum. It's dedicated to the members of the 390th Bomb Group in England during World War II. There's only one airplane in there. It's a B-17, so if you're a B-17 fan, that's a good place to go see it. Let's see. On a couple more planes on the right. There's one of the Blue Angels planes. That's an old Grumman Tiger over there. And next to it, number 531, is the Navy Fury. That was the Navy version of the F-86. How are you? You want to sit up front? But I'll show you the Air Force Sabre. So this plane, this light gray plane with GJ on the tail, number 315 on the nose, is the North American RA-5 Vigilante. The Vigilante was first built as a bomber for the Navy, and it has a tunnel in back between the two engines, and that's where the bombs came out. And then when that mission went away, they became reconnaissance planes, and you can see the reconnaissance pod kind of looks like a canoe underneath the fuselage. There were problems with the tunnel system, and when the Navy tried to put extra fuel tanks in there for the reconnaissance planes, sometimes the fuel tanks fell out. So it wasn't a real good system. But this was a supersonic reconnaissance plane, so that was pretty cool. The next plane on the right with number 62 on the tail is the Grumman A6 Intruder. Anybody ever see the movie Flight of the Intruder? No? This was a flying truck for the Navy from the Vietnam War up through the first Gulf War in the early 90s. It carries a crew of 2. The pilot sits on the left side and the bombardier navigator sits on the right. The BN has a bombing radar, so he has his head down in the radar scope, and you can see the big dome in front. That's where the radar antenna was. The ball underneath the dome, that's a more recent addition to give them night vision, laser targeting, etc. The big pole sticking out of the top of the dome, like before, that's a refueling probe, so they can refuel from an aerial tanker.
Was McKean flying the A6 or A4?
So number 307 is the A7 Corsair, a little bit smaller than the A6. This was a single-seat, single-engine attack plane. Again, flew roughly from the Vietnam War through the first Gulf War. Smaller radar in the nose. Not as much of an all-weather attack plane. Now the last plane in this row, before we start the turn, last plane in this row, number 88, is the Douglas A4 Skyhawk. This was the type of plane that the Argentines flew against the British Harriers in the Falklands War in 1982. It's also the kind of plane that Lieutenant, now Senator John McCain, was flying in the Vietnam War. One day he was sitting in his A4 on the deck of the Forrestal and it was hit by a missile accidentally launched from another plane and caught fire, and he got out, but the Forrestal fire burned for like 2 days. It was a terrible tragedy. A couple months later, Lieutenant McCain was flying an A4 off the Oriskany, another Navy carrier, and that's when he was shot down and became a POW in North Vietnam. Yesterday, I gave a tour just like this to a group from the Navy Attack Squadron who flew the A4s in Vietnam. So they were really interested, and everybody wanted to come out and hug the plane. So the bright blue plane says Blue Angels, really was a Blue Angels plane. This is the F-A-18 Hornet. This is the A model Hornet, which the Blues have retired. The Navy's flying newer versions of the airplane now. The Hornet came to us looking pretty much just like that. And notice the very robust landing gear on the Hornet. That's because it has to land on an aircraft carrier, and there's no such thing as a gentle landing on the carrier. The building on the left is Hangar 1. We're going to let you off right here when we're done this tour. Immediately on your left is the grill, if you need a bite to eat or a cup of coffee. And then the SR-71 is all the way that way. When it's time, hang on just a second. When it's time to head back to the bus at
12 o'clock.
At noon today, go out through the gift shop. It's the only way out of the museum. Of course. So the gift shop is on my right side of this hangar, here by the 3 big doors. Go all the way forward, that's where the gift shop is. That's the only way out, and the bus will meet you out in the traffic circle where Kim picked me up at noon.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So on your left, in contrast to the Navy F-18 Hornet, is the Air Force's F-15 Eagle. Again, this is still a primary fighter for the Air Force. There's also an attack version. But notice the spindly landing gear. I call them chicken legs because the Air Force, the F-15 can always land on nice long runways. We don't normally have them here at Davis Monthan, but I did see a few take off a few days ago. It's a big 2-engine plane. much bigger than the F-16 that we saw part of back in restoration. Okay. Next two planes, one on the left, one on the right, are both F-4 Phantoms. I think somebody asked about the Phantoms. The white nose one is the Navy B model on your right, and the black nose one is the Air Force C model on your left. The Phantoms went to Vietnam in the 60s without a built-in gun, and they were at a disadvantage then until the E model came along. And when you see the E model Phantom in Hangar 1, right next to the grill, you'll see it has a much longer nose section, and that's where the built-in gun is on the Phantom. They were originally designed just to carry missiles. Next plane coming up on the right side, number 29, is the F-8 Crusader. This is a single-seat supersonic fighter. The Phantom was a two-seat supersonic fighter. The Crusader was originally built with just guns, so it was called Last of the Great Gunfighters. In 1957, a Marine Corps test pilot named John Glenn set a cross-country speed record in a Crusader. You've heard of John Glenn, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. He went on to be the first American to orbit the Earth, and then he went back to space in the space shuttle years later. Of the original 7 Mercury astronauts, how many are still alive today? Actually, just one, just John Glenn. Yeah. And he was the oldest when they all started back in the late 50s.
He's getting pretty old.
Two planes on your left are Republic F-105 Thunder Chiefs. The one with the teeth is the two-seat version, and it was a Wild Weasel in Vietnam. The Wild Weasels went out ahead of the strike group and teased the enemy radars. And when the ground-based radars came on in order to shoot a surface-to-air missile at the airplane, the Wild Weasel planes would detect that and shoot a missile down the radar beam and take out the radar sight. That made life much safer for the single-seat fighter bombers. Your Big Sal was the single-seat fighter bomber. The F-105 was originally designed to carry a nuclear weapon internally, but in Vietnam, I think they carried all their stores externally. Question, yes?
Is it true that they can just like shoot flares and that'll like set like missiles?
There are several ways. If somebody launches a missile at you, there's several ways to try to make it not hit. And one is to shoot flares, and that may, if there's a heat-seeking sensor on the missile, and shooting flares out around you may confuse the missile. So modern planes all have chaff, which is like crumbled aluminum foil, which can also deter a radar-guided missile. So modern planes can dispense chaff and flares to confuse surface-to-air missiles. Yeah. A couple of Navy trainers on the right. You can tell they're trainers by the orange paint, so the student pilots can see each other flying around the pattern. 386 with the blue nose. That's the Grumman Cougar with guns in the nose. A single-seat trainer, so probably used for gunnery training for pilots who already knew how to fly the plane. And then number 517 is a two-seat Cougar used to teach pilots how to fly the plane. And then the next plane coming up on the right, number 25, this is the Grumman Panther. Now notice the Panther has straight wings. The Cougar, both Cougars have swept wings. And the swept wings are much better in fast jets, get better performance. But coming out of World War II, the American designers, the airplane designers, didn't understand that yet. So the first jets that were built by Lockheed, Grumman, and others were straight wing jets. So the Panther was I believe, the Navy's first carrier-based jet in the Korean War in the early 50s. Anybody know any famous Panther pilots from the Korean War? Well, John Glenn, we mentioned him. He was a Marine Corps Panther pilot.
Would Bush have been one of them?
No, he was in World War II. Ted Williams, the baseball player. He was John Glenn's buddy in the Marine Corps Air Squadron. And Neil Armstrong, who went on to be the first man to walk on the moon. He was also a Panther pilot in World War II. Neil Armstrong's first flight in space was Gemini 8. I think the anniversary of Gemini 8 was just a week or so ago. It was kind of an aborted flight. They hooked up to the Agena targeting vehicle, they docked with the Agena, and then started tumbling out of control. So they disengaged and still kept tumbling. So to stop the tumbling, they had to use some reserve fuel, and the flight rules say if you use that fuel, you have to come back down right away. So it was a Gemini mission, but it only lasted 10 hours. So, but he proved he had the right stuff, and that's why his next flight was Apollo 11 to walk on the moon. On the left side is the McDonnell F-101 Voodoo. The Voodoo was originally designed as an escort fighter in the early 50s, a Mach 1 escort fighter, but the Strategic Air Command decided they did not need an escort fighter. So some of the A-model Voodoos went back into the factory and came out with bigger engines and were redesignated B models. And you can see ours has engines that stick out, way out past the engine housing. And they became interceptors to protect the United States against an attack from outside. So on the right is that Grumman Tiger. Navy didn't really like it. It didn't have what we call long legs. It couldn't carry a lot of fuel or fly very far, carry much of a payload. So they didn't keep it around long. But the military went through a lot of planes in the 50s because aviation technology after World War II was accelerating so quickly. And then 531 is the Fury. This is the plane that essentially the Navy version of the F-86. A couple of very interesting planes on the left side. The first one with the long black nose is the General Dynamics F-111 Aardvark. The F-111 is most famous for its role in President Reagan's El Diablo Canyon raid on Libya back in the 1980s. Because the plane has the ability to carry nuclear or conventional weapons, even though they were carrying conventional weapons on that mission, they were not allowed to fly over mainland Europe. So they had to fly out of England, where they were based, out into the Atlantic, then come to the south and back to the east through the Strait of Gibraltar. It required several tankings and made for like a 12-hour mission for that two-man crew. On your left, you can see Hangar 3. It's that yellow building with the big 3 on it. And that's part of the World War II collection, and then Hangar 4 behind it. Somebody had a question.
Yeah,
yes, sir.
how many planes do you have to shoot down to be an ace?
I think the question was how many planes do you have to shoot down to be an ace? I believe it's 5. Yes. So the next plane on the left is the Panavia Tornado.
Excuse me.
This was in German Navy colors. Panavia built planes. It was kind of a conglomerate of German, Italian, and British company. And the Tornadoes flew very well for the British in the first Gulf War. And then the third plane in this row is the MiG-23. Not a very safe plane to fly. Now all 3 of these planes have something in common. Anybody know what it was? They all had variable sweep wings. Excuse me. So to fly slow, the wings would come out, extra drag but lots of lift, and to fly fast, the wings would sweep back. Anybody know what other plane has that capability?
F-14.
Yeah, the F-14 Tomcat. You'll see an F-14 when you go into Hangar 1, with the wings swept all the way back for parking. Kind of across the nose of Air Force One. If you're kind of right, in front of the bus is right at the nose, you might have a good angle. Like to hold it up and stick it in the car. Maybe about 8 or 10 feet off the hangar, but we want to be going that way. Everybody doing okay?
Yeah.
I don't hear any snoring, so I'm assuming everybody's still having a good time.
You're doing good.
Everybody having a good time?
She hasn't seen a Barbie yet, though.
Oh, a Barbie. I don't think we have a Barbie plane.
The princess plane.
Oh, the princess.
The wild.
We don't have a Ken plane. I can see how you can stay busy just helping him pick up his stuff. Is this your brother? So he could be your boyfriend.
There's There's
I
one
won't
for the
press the
journal.
point. We can go a little bit closer.
That would be a little bit odd. Your mother-in-law.
So the plane coming up on your left is the VC-118. It's an old DC-6, 1950s vintage passenger plane, but it was used as Air Force One by both President Kennedy and President Johnson in the 60s. Yes, they did have a big 707 that they flew around in, but back in the 60s, the 707 couldn't get into every airfield, so they used this to get into smaller airfields. A lot of people ask, was this the plane that was in Dallas in November 1963? No, that was one of the big 707s. This plane used to be open to the public. If you were here prior to about 6 years ago, you could have gone inside it, but the Air Force, who owns the plane, said too much wear and tear, we have to preserve it, so they closed it to access. I can describe the inside to you. I'm not sure if everybody will follow what I'm saying, but in 4 words. Ready? Ricky and Lucy's apartment. So if you have a Googler at home, you know, one of those things where you Google stuff. If you Google Ricky and Lucy, you'll see they were TV stars back in the 50s and 60s, and the inside of this plane kind of looks like their apartment. Sorry, it's a joke for us older folks. Okay, notice the blue paint over the cockpit. That was designed by a man named Raymond Loewy. He was an industrial designer. He designed streamlined cars and trains and company logos and stuff like that. Pretty famous guy in his time. He designed the paint scheme for the Kennedys, and apparently Jackie liked the blue paint over the cockpit and said that any plane her husband flies in has to have that paint. A couple years ago, President Obama was here, and his Air Force One now is a Boeing 747. There are 2 of them. And we saw him land right across the street at Davis-Monthan, and the 747 has blue paint over the cockpit. So what was an idea back in the 1960s became a tradition, and all the Air Force Ones have it. Any questions about this plane?
Kind of the same position. Maybe let's stop a little bit before so we can all see it after that.
Okay, next plane coming up on the left is one of those big 707s. This is a big executive jet. It was an Eisenhower administration acquisition back in the late 50s. Never flew as Air Force One. How do we know?
No blue paint.
No blue paint over the cockpit, right. So this was a backup plane for many years. Vice President Gore flew in this plane, so it did fly under the call sign of Air Force
2.
2, but never as Air Force One. This plane is very famous, but largely unknown. One mission made it very famous. So back in 1979, some radical students in Tehran took over the U.S. Embassy, and there were 50-some embassy workers that were held hostage inside the embassy. I think a half dozen of them got out, hid in the Canadian ambassador's house, till Ben Affleck came to save them. Right? You've seen the movie Argo, right? True story. But anyway, about 50-some of the hostages were stuck behind in the embassy for 444 days. The day that they were released was the day that President Carter turned over to President Reagan in 1981. And this was the plane that brought the hostages out of Tehran.
Wow.
Yeah, so it flew under the call sign of Freedom One. Very famous, but not a very well-known story. Any questions? If you look off to the right, the silver constellation there, that's our 3rd constellation. That was General Eisenhower's personal plane. Near the back door, and you can't see it because of the wing, but near the back door is a red plaque with 5 stars, because he was a 5-star general at the time. Notice on the nose it says Columbine, and there's some flowers there. Columbine is the state flower of Colorado, which was Mamie's adopted state. So this was his first Columbine airplane, and then he had 2 as president that were also nicknamed Columbine. Yes, ma'am.
For these 2 president planes, is there any like extra security numbers like provided?
Here?
Yeah. No, like when they were flying.
So when Air Force One flies, there's always security available. I think in general they don't fly with escorts, but I know that the military is standing by wherever Air Force One goes to provide external security. I've heard that Air Force One has some built-in security measures. It may have the ability to dispense chaff or flares to deter missiles, but I don't know. But certainly the military is always available to escort Air Force One if necessary. Yeah. Good question. Any others? Okay, the Army helicopter on your right, behind Ike's Constellation there, was a helicopter that the president used to fly between the White House and Andrews Air Force Base. Now it's totally a Marine Corps responsibility, but it used to be shared between the Army and the Marines.
Turn right. So this wing on the B-36, but the reason I want to kind of fill in that gap there, no, we don't need to go too tight. So I want to place it in fat thing. That's why I see this really fat, but we want to turn out here the wing. You're doing a great job.
Hey, Kim's doing a great job. Give him a round of applause. He's keeping my safety record unblemished. So another Navy C-9 on the left, troop and cargo transport. And then as we start to make our turn to the right, this 4-engine propeller plane, the Navy plane, is the P-3. Now ours is an executive version called the VP-3, V for VIPs. But the P-3 was and still is a submarine hunter for the Navy. They've been flying since the early 60s. So the newest ones are about 50 years old, and but they're still doing a great job hunting for submarines and doing other reconnaissance, surveillance type work for the Navy.
The goldfish. The wood on the tail, is that stock?
The wood on the tail, I think, is just to keep the rudder from swinging.
Aftermarket 2x4. Whatever it was.
Okay, we're going to make the turn till everybody in the bus can see that big fat plane. Let me know in the back of the bus when you can see it. Okay?
What is it?
Okay, so that big fat plane with NASA on the tail, can everybody see it all right? That's called the Super Guppy. The Guppies were made out of Boeing Stratocruisers, and if you look way off in the distance, you can see to the right of that gigantic fuel tank back there, you can see a Boeing Stratocruiser. It's white with a red cross on the tail. Can you see it? So that's what the Super Guppy looked like before it was modified. So the Stratocruisers, some of them were made into Guppies. Anybody know why the Guppies were made?
No.
So back in the 1960s, there was a need to quickly transport the third stage of the Saturn V rocket. It's the rocket that took the astronauts to the moon. They needed to get them quickly from California to Florida for launch. And the third stage, without fuel and without the lunar module inside, was light enough to fly in the belly of an airplane, but it needed a plane with a 25-foot diameter fuselage. So that's why the Guppies were made. You see that white vertical stripe that goes up just behind the cockpit there, forward of that little door at the bottom? That's actually the seam. And the nose section opens up, it rotates and opens up so that the cargo can go inside.
Do you guys have a dream lifter here? No?
I thought, the question was, do we have a dream lifter here? Dream lifter is a modified, there's only a couple of them, a modified 747 that Boeing uses to carry smaller airplanes inside it, or airplane components to get them between factories. And I thought that's how the 787 was going to arrive tomorrow, but I understand it's flying in by itself with the wings attached, and all they're going to do is swap out the engines when it comes over here. But
I built parts for that.
Okay, two other NASA planes I'm going to tell you about on the left. I think we're in a good position to see them. The first one's that little Gulfstream. It's missing engines and it's pointed right towards us. You see it? the white business jet with the blue trim. So NASA uses Gulfstreams for transports. They used to use them for flying space shuttle crews between Florida and Texas. Some of them, and not ours, but some of them had dual controls inside. Space shuttle controls on one side and Gulfstream controls on the other side. So they were used as landing trainers for the space shuttle pilots. They would approach to landing in a real steep descent, and then the Gulfstream pilot would take over to go back around to try it again. Now the big 707 there with the white with the blue stripe and NASA on the tail, that's our third NASA plane. It's hollow inside, and the bulkheads are padded. Anybody know what it was used for?
Simulate zero G.
Right, it was known as the Weightless Wonder, more commonly known as the Vomit Comet, and they were used to train astronauts in zero G. They would fly a parabolic profile, so uphill, over the top, and back down, and for about 30 seconds or so, everything inside would be weightless. And that's how they train astronauts in zero G. Anybody ever see the movie Apollo 13 with Tom Hanks, Gary Sinise, Kevin Bacon? Well, this was before computer-generated weightlessness. So like Sandra Bullock and George Clooney, they were computer-generated weightless in a more recent movie. But in Apollo 13, the director, who was the director of Apollo 13? Opie. Ron Howard was the director. And he built the sets inside these NASA airplanes.
No way.
And they filmed 30 seconds at a time, maybe 100 flights a day, that kind of thing. And that's how they filmed those zero G segments of the movie. Yeah. So next time you watch Apollo 13, you'll see any of those zero G segments. None of them were very long, only a few seconds long, because that's how long they could film in weightlessness.
Wow.
Yeah, pretty cool. All right, this big plane that we're gonna kind of half circle on the left here is the Convair B-36. Notice it has 6 propeller engines and 4 jet engines. These were originally designed to fly during World War II in case Great Britain fell to Germany during the war. This would enable the Allies to fly bombing missions all the way from North America, because the B-36 was designed to fly 10,000 miles unrefueled and stay aloft for about 40 hours, 40 hours.
Wow.
Yeah. So luckily they didn't have to fly during World War II, but they became a strategic bomber in the early years of the Cold War. And if you look underneath, you can see it has 2 really big bomb bays, so it could carry a very large load of weapons down there. The entire plane is not pressurized for high altitude flight, only the crew compartments. Obviously the bomb bay area is not pressurized because they would lose that pressure when they open the bomb bay doors. But going above the bomb bay is a tunnel, and there's a little trolley in that tunnel so the crew members can slide back and forth between the flight deck area and the aft crew compartment. Anybody ever see the Jimmy Stewart movie, Strategic Air Command? With June Allison and Jimmy Stewart? Some of the scenes were filmed using B-36.
Let's head towards that guy. We're not going to go that way. As soon as we get towards the nose, we'll start it. And he's like ready for the rain. I like that. Just what's up? Actually, we can start the turn, but I'd like to stop right in the middle of the run here. So maybe right back around the
That looks.
I don't know if they cleaned the windows or if they took them out with blanks.
Yeah, they work glass.
Oh yeah, I know. Yeah. But for the
You could just have a film.
Okay, so we're
Just have
stopping in
a
the middle of the
film.
road here for a few minutes. I just want to point out some of the planes off in the distance to the left. The first one, the dark gray plane, number 90 in the tail, is the British Shackleton, built by Avro. The Avro Shackleton was built as a submarine hunter during the Cold War. Coming out of World War II, the British were flying hand-me-down American aircraft that were left over from World War II. And then they built the Shackleton to fly their own maritime patrols. A dozen of the Shackletons were taken out of the maritime patrol submarine hunting business and made into airborne early warning planes. So that's what we have. You can see it has that big chin radar for detecting air contacts. If you look all the way off in the corner at about 10 o'clock, you can see a silver plane with 4 propeller engines and 2 jet engines. This is a KB-50 tanker. They were upgrades to the B-29 was the B-50, and then the K makes it a tanker. K is the designation for a tanker. The jet engines were added to give it a little bit extra speed and power. And that tank-looking thing out on the wing is not a fuel tank or a bomb. It's actually a hose reel. You know, there's a garden hose in there all wound up, and on the end of that hose is a basket, and that trails out behind the plane. There's one on the other, on the left wingtip also. It trails out behind the plane, and then the receiving plane, the one that needs fuel, comes up, and that probe that you saw like on the Harrier and the A6 and the A4, the John McCain plane, that probe fits into the basket, and that's how the receiving plane gets fuel. So that's how Navy and Marine Corps planes refuel. Air Force, smaller Air Force planes used to do it that way, but now the Air Force planes get fuel from a probe that comes down, a pole that comes down from the tanker and fits into the receiving plane. The gray and white plane says United States Air Force on it, is built as a tanker, and it has that big probe in back that goes into the receiving plane. It was called the KC-135, but ours is actually called the EC-135. It has some extra communications, command and control equipment on board. It was part of a program called Looking Glass, and there were a lot of Looking Glass planes, and one was aloft 24/7, 365 for 30 years. From 1961 to 1991, there was always a Looking Glass plane in the air with a general on board. He and his battle staff could help run the war if they were necessary, if it was necessary. Yeah. A little bit closer, the 6-engine jet with 2135 on the nose. That's the Boeing B-47. Davis Monthan used to be a B-47 base back in the 50s and 60s. They were right across the street. B-47 carried a crew of 3, and it was a strategic bomber during the Cold War. Okay, we're going to complete the turn. This big silver plane coming up on the left was the third of our B-52s. You saw the other 2 in restoration. Now this was an A model B-52, and the A's were only used for testing. And this one had a very special purpose. And if you look between the fuselage and the inboard engines, that's good. If you look between the fuselage and the inboard engines, you see a big bracket. So do you know what this mission, what this airplane's mission was?
Nuclear.
Close. Under that, in that bracket there, that bracket held the X-15 rocket plane. So the X-15 could fly over 6 times the speed of sound and over 60 miles high, but it couldn't take off by itself. It was a rocket-powered plane, and it would glide into land, but it couldn't take off by itself. So this and one other B-52 were modified to carry the X-15 aloft. They take it up to about 40,000 feet and release it.
That's cool.
Yeah.
No, I'm not that.
If you go into the space gallery, and we'll pull up by the space gallery in a few minutes, you'll see it from the outside.
It can fly like 6 times faster.
You can't turn right anymore.
Something. But it couldn't fly by like.
It's like watch your tail. 700.
That's a really small plane.
So the little gray thing is the Quail, which was a drone designed to simulate a B-52. So again, it should attract enemy weapons rather than them heading toward the bomber. Okay, so this area on the left, this is where we have our stealth planes.
I got killed by an RC.
You guys didn't hear me. This area on the left is where we have our stealth planes.
Stealth? I don't
Okay, we're waiting now.
So actually, this is where the other two B-52s will go when they're restored. We've got some trainers coming up on the right. The Cessna T-37, known as the Tweet, is the first one. T stands for trainer, obviously. The next one is the TF-102. This is the training version of the F-102 supersonic interceptor.
That's like getting in an MG.
Look how tiny that green one is.
Yeah, the little green plane is the
Hike a leg up and crawl in.
That's like the moped of jets. That's crazy how tiny it is.
You were just looking at a
that movie?
B-52.
Charlie Sheen was in a couple of airplane spoof movies. Yeah, I think one of them they used gnats in the movie. Number 814 is a North American T2 Buckeye. Anybody from Ohio? No. Oh, they were built in Columbus, Ohio. That's why they're called the Buckeye. And number 270 is another Navy trainer, the T-28 Trojan.
So all the trainers are in orange?
The orange paint on the trainers is to help the brand new student pilots keep an eye on each other as a lot of them are flying around the airfield.
It's like the big L on the back of your car when you're driving.
Watch out for that guy. Yes.
Have you ever heard of the Admiral Arrow?
I've heard. I mean, yes, but we don't have one. So a couple of first-generation jets coming up on the right, the F-94 and the F-89, and you can tell they're first-generation jets because of the
Straight wings.
straight wings. No, the straight wings. Right.
Grace! Grace! Grace!
And then we have some bombers coming up on the left, some non-stealthy bombers. The B-57 is the first one here with J-O on the tail. Not a real famous bomber by itself, but there is a weather observation version
There's your
with the
airplanes,
wings
Ollie.
twice as long. So here comes the B-58. The silver plane with the black nose on the left is the B-58 Hustler. This was a supersonic strategic bomber. Carries a crew of 3, only one of which was a pilot. And then there were 2 other crew members behind the pilot. Inside that gigantic fuel tank under the fuselage, buried in that fuel tank was one really big nuclear weapon. And they would burn that fuel first, outbound towards the target. And then when they got to the target, it was time to release the bomb, they just released the fuel tank and the bomb together. And then without that fuel tank, if you cover with your hand, you can see it's a pretty sleek plane to make its way home. Which is a reaction in the tank there, but there may have been a different configuration where it carried multiple bombs.
Yeah, I think
Okay, you can go back to the movies. They were more.
Did they have the ones that multiple warheads at all, or at that time?
Grace
that was
still looks
an
Grace. That fish that's
multiple independently charged.
Yeah, it's a rocket.
It's only good if they're coming down from space.
Right.
Otherwise, the warheads don't.
Time to disperse.
Then we have the Canadian Air Force, which is the flock of.
We actually have a Canadian plane in Hangar 1. There's a Canadian F-86, a Canadian Sabre
Tyler, sit down.
in Hangar 1 up in the overhead where they do it.
Do this with you.
Several MiGs on the right. Most of the MiGs came to the United States when former Soviet allies wanted to give up their MiGs at the end of the Cold War, either in exchange for cash or in exchange for Western airplanes. And part of the deal was you had to give up the MiGs, so the Intel folks got as much information as they could out of them, and then they were turned over to the museum.
Man, they look like
A couple of lighter bombers on the left. The tan and green camouflage one is the Douglas B-66, the Air Force version, and then the Navy Sky Warrior here with the red engine covers. Otherwise commonly known as the Whale because it was really big, landing on an aircraft carrier.
What are those domes on the side there?
This was a electronic warfare plane, so those domes may have been antennas of some sort,
Oh, okay.
along with the big tubular thing on top of the tail. And then we have several helicopters. I'm not going to talk about all of them.
So big a big dragonfly. Different lifting. It's like lifting.
So the blue building coming up on the right is our space gallery. If you're into space vehicles, we have a lot of mock-ups in there, full-size X-15 mock-up. And there are some models and pictures that show the X-15 hanging from the B-52. So if you want to see how that worked, you can see it in there. There's an Apollo command module mock-up, several models, and a real moon rock. So if you've never seen a moon rock, you can see one in the space gallery there. Helicopters on the left, everybody. You can see the Huey with the red cross. That's a larger version of the Huey. We have a smaller model inside Hangar 1. And then the next two helicopters are called Huskies. And they had side-by-side intermeshing rotors
Oh, that's crazy.
instead of tandem rotors. The two orange helicopters are Coast Guard helicopters with boat holes so they can land in the water if necessary.
Those side-by-side rotors, were they like, were they timed or?
Wow.
Wow.
I think the side-by-side intermeshing rotors were they
Like
were on a
cantilever,
common,
yeah.
and there was like a common shaft or gear mechanism or whatever that kept them from hitting
Yeah.
each other.
That's sketchy.
Oh, we slipped the tube on the gear.
A couple of
timing belt broke.
Piasecki built the flying banana helicopters, and then the orange one is a little Navy trainer. The last two helicopters are called Dragonflies. Mickey Rooney, the actor, was in the movie The Bridges of Tokyo-ri, a Korean warrior movie with William Holden, and Mickey Rooney was a rescue helicopter pilot in the Dragonfly. The silver one was a Coast Guard helicopter. It was actually in the Arctic and the Antarctic. And so it flew near both the top and the bottom of the world. If you look over to your right, you'll see the big green Army helicopter. This was a Sikorsky Sky Crane. It was a heavy lift helicopter, Vietnam era, and it could carry lots of heavy things, but in particular containerized cargo between those legs there, or sections of like a mobile field hospital. Sikorsky's not in that business anymore, but the Ericsson company supports the air cranes now, and they're used to lift air conditioners to the top of skyscrapers or radio antennas to the top of mountains, but also for fighting wildfires. They can carry a 3,000-gallon water tank underneath with a long elephant trunk that sticks out the bottom, and they suck water out of a lake and then drop it on the fire. Off in the left corner there is the Sikorsky MH-53 Pavlo helicopter for delivering special operations troops. You see it has a refueling probe sticking out of the nose and some special sensors to give it nap of the earth flying capability. And then a couple more of those painted planes in the distance there.
I'm laughing too hard.
The Soviet Mi-24 Hind on your left in light green camouflage was a Cold War era gunship. And I'm not sure how many of them Sylvester Stallone knocked out of the air in the Rambo movies, but at least a couple. We're going to head back around towards Hangar 1. I'll be outside the bus for a few minutes as you get off, and I'll be happy to answer questions about anything you want to go see, where any of the planes are. I do want to make one more loop so you can see the F-86, and we'll make a quick loop by there. So don't forget, be back out front. I'll hop on the bus at noon. In Arizona, it's now 10:06. I don't know what time it was, wherever you came from, but it's 10:06 here in Arizona. Again, this is the Space Gallery on the right. This is a ground-launched cruise missile display on your left, using the Tomahawk missile, which, by the way, are made about 10 minutes down the road by Raytheon. These convoys drove around Europe during the 1980s.
That's the only thing I can
Race.
Okay, a couple planes coming up on the right leading up to the Sabre here. Well, on the right is the F-5 with the big yellow stripe. This was primarily an export fighter. On the left you see the pink plane. That's a Jaguar. It was a British-French airplane. The pink is actually called Desert Pink. And I'm not sure what desert it matches, but it does not match the Sonoran Desert.
It's the ladies' desert. Tori, it's a pink plane.
It's the Barbie plane.
So, right here on the right is the Barbie plane. Is that right? No. Oh, she's asleep. Bummer. So, number 525 is the North American F-86 Sabre. This was the swept-wing fighter that helped turn the air war around in Korea because the MiG-15s were taking advantage of the straight-wing American fighters. And then when the Sabre came over, it helped turn the air war around.
Which one's the Barbie plane? I'm not sure.
Did you get some good pictures?
No, I'm on the wrong side of the bus for it. That's okay.
You want me to take one for you?
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to put the mic down for a second.
That was my dad's favorite plane. We committed
the picnic right there. Right beside.
I think I'm lighter than him.
You?
That's ethnic. Okay, that's ethnic. No, picnic on that one. You looking like a rock.
I think I got two good ones.
But you know, everyone's
Okay, we're going to make a U-turn to the left and head back to Hangar 1, which is the green building behind us. As a reminder, you can see hangars 3 and 4. That's our World War II collection off to the left. And the 390th Bomb Group Memorial Museum is the building with the flag right now straight in front of us.
Is he laughing?
No, it was like one. You didn't like it.
So I hope everybody enjoyed the tour. And I hope you learned something because I understand there's going to be a quiz this afternoon.
I was gonna give a compliment to your boss about you.
Thank you.
That's insane.
There's a video playing up here.
Wow, this thing's huge. It's called the Big Bombs.
What they do with the Tucker? It was an airplane engine just like that. This is the right fire.